Faithful German Shepherd says goodbye to its police owner, then stuns the doctor. The crisp morning air was still heavy with fog when Officer Caleb Dawson walked into the police academy's K-9 training facility. The sound of barking echoed through the air, a symphony of eager and disciplined canines waiting for their turn to prove their worth. Caleb had seen dozens of dogs before, but none had caught his attention quite like the German Shepherd standing silently in the far corner of the training field. Unlike the others, this one didn't bark or jump excitedly against the fencing. He stood tall, observing everything with sharp, calculating eyes. The trainers had already briefed Caleb on his options. There were stronger, more aggressive dogs that had already excelled in the early training phases. But something about this quiet, watchful shepherd intrigued him. "That's Titan," one of the trainers said, following Caleb's gaze. "He's smart but different. Doesn't always follow orders the way we want. A bit too independent." Caleb stepped closer, watching as Titan's ears perked up, his eyes locking onto the officers. There was something in that gaze, an understanding, a silent challenge, as if the dog was waiting for someone who could match him. Caleb crouched down and extended his hand. Titan didn't hesitate. He stepped forward, pressing his cold nose against Caleb's palm before sitting down, his tail flicking once against the dirt. A slow smile spread across Caleb's face. "I'll take him." The trainers exchanged uncertain glances. "Are you sure? He's not the easiest. Some think he won't make it through the program." But Caleb wasn't listening. He could already feel it. This wasn't just a police dog. This was a partner, a kindred spirit. Training was brutal. Titan was relentless. Every day, Caleb pushed him to his limits, making him run longer, jump higher, track sense through rain and snow. There were moments when Titan's stubborn streak shone through. He wasn't one to blindly obey. He had his own instincts, his own judgment. But over time, Caleb realized that this wasn't disobedience. Titan wasn't resisting commands out of defiance. He was thinking, calculating, adapting. He wasn't just a K-9 unit, he was something more. They became an unstoppable force. In the years that followed, their reputation spread throughout the department. Titan had an uncanny ability to sense danger before it struck. He had taken down armed criminals, found missing children in the dead of night, and sniffed out explosives before they could detonate. But beyond the job, beyond the uniform and the duty, there was something deeper. Titan wasn't just a tool of the police force. He was Caleb's best friend, his shadow, his protector. They weren't just officer and dog. They were brothers, too. The last mission, the event that changes everything, started like any other night. A call came through, urgent, high risk. An escaped convict had taken hostages inside an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the city. The suspect was armed and dangerous. The SWAT team was already preparing for entry, but time was running out. Caleb and Titan arrived on the scene, stepping into the controlled chaos of flashing lights and tense voices. The police captain briefed them quickly. "The guys barricaded inside. We've got hostages, at least 3, maybe more. No visual on the weapon, but he's already fired shots. We go in now, or we risk losing innocent lives." Caleb knelt beside Titan, running a steady hand over his thick fur. "You ready, buddy?" Titan's ears perked, his body vibrating with energy. He knew what was coming. The team moved in, sweeping through the building, their boots barely making a sound against the cold concrete floor. Titan led the way, his nose twitching as he tracked the scent of the suspect. Caleb's heart pounded, adrenaline sharpening his focus. They had done this before. They had faced worse. But something felt off. Titan suddenly halted, his body rigid, his hackles rising. Caleb barely had time to react before a deafening shot rang through the air. Pain exploded through his side. His breath hitched as he staggered backward, his vision blurring. Titan moved before anyone else could. He was a streak of black and tan, a blur of muscle and fury as he lunged at the gunman. The suspect had no time to react before Titan's powerful jaws clamped down on his arm, sending the weapon skidding across the floor. The world spun around Caleb. The voices of his team sounded distant, muffled. Sirens screamed in the distance. He could feel the blood soaking through his uniform, pooling beneath him. His fingers twitched, reaching out, but his strength was fading. The last thing he saw before darkness swallowed him was Titan, standing protectively over him, snarling at anyone who dared come close. 3. The heartbreaking goodbye, the funeral scene. The city mourned. 3 days later, officers from all over the state gathered at the funeral. The sky was gray, a cruel reflection of the grief that hung in the air. A sea of uniformed officers stood in formation, their badges draped in black ribbons. The chief of police stood at the podium, his voice steady despite the weight of sorrow. He spoke of Caleb's bravery, his dedication, the sacrifices he had made to protect others. But no words could describe the true weight of the loss, and no words could prepare anyone for what happened next. Titan had been brought to the ceremony by his new handler, but as soon as the flag-draped coffin was lowered into the ground, he pulled free from his leash. A hush fell over the crowd as Titan moved forward. He didn't bark. He didn't whimper. He simply lay down beside the coffin, pressing his massive body against the wooden surface as if he could still feel Caleb's warmth beneath it. His breathing was slow, deep, almost as if he was waiting for a command that would never come. Officers wiped their eyes, swallowing hard against the lump in their throats. Even the toughest among them, the ones who had seen war, who had held the line against the worst of humanity, couldn't hold back their tears. Titan stayed there, unmoving, for what felt like hours. He refused to leave. He refused to accept that Caleb was gone. It was only when the last notes of the bugle faded into silence that Titan let out a sound no one would ever forget. A low, mournful howl. A sound so raw, so full of sorrow, that it cut through the very air itself. Some officers turned away, unable to bear the sight. Others wept openly. Titan had lost more than a handler. He had lost his world. But what no one knew was that this wasn't the end. Titan knew something no one else did. Something was coming. Something that would change everything. Shadow had always been more than just a police dog. He was Caleb's partner, his protector, and his closest companion. For years, they had moved as one, understanding each other without words, relying on instinct and trust. Shadow had been there in the darkest of nights, chasing down criminals, sniffing out danger, and always standing guard, ready to lay down his life for Caleb. But now, Caleb was gone, and something inside Shadow had broken. At first, the officers at the precinct assumed his grief was natural. K9s form deep emotional bonds with their handlers, and when that bond is suddenly severed, they mourn in ways that are both heartbreaking and deeply human. Many had seen dogs refuse to leave their handler's grave, waiting at the door for them to return, crying softly in the night. But with Shadow, it was different. His sorrow didn't just linger, it began to consume him. It started subtly. He ignored his food bowl, sniffing at it before turning away. He rejected treats, even the ones he had once loved. His muscles, once strong and defined, began to weaken. His ribs became more visible beneath his thick coat, and his usually sharp and alert demeanor faded into something distant and haunted. The officers tried everything to help him. They brought in trainers, familiar faces, even Caleb's belongings, hoping the scent would bring comfort. But nothing worked. Shadow wasn't just grieving, he was lost. Then came the pacing. Late at night, officers on duty would hear the soft clicking of his nails against the tile floor, an endless rhythm of unrest. He would stop suddenly, ears twitching, as if listening to something only he could hear. Sometimes he would rush to the entrance of the station and sit there, completely still, his eyes locked on the door. As the days passed, his strange behavior became more pronounced. One evening, an officer found him in Caleb's old office, his nose pressed against the locker where his handler's uniform was stored. He let out a low whimper, his tail flicking just once, before lowering himself to the ground and refusing to move. The most unsettling moment came at the cemetery. The first time they brought Shadow to Caleb's grave, he froze. His body stiffened, his breath quickened, and then, without warning, he let out a soft, sorrowful howl that sent shivers down the spines of those who heard it. But what happened next was even stranger. His ears perked up, his head tilted slightly, and his tail wagged once, hesitantly. It was as if he had heard something. The officers exchanged nervous glances. Shadow's reaction wasn't one of grief alone. It was as if he was sensing something beyond their understanding. The doctor's doubts and the unexpected discovery. Concerned for Shadow's health, the department called in Dr. Eleanor Graves, the most experienced veterinarian they knew. She had worked with countless K9s before, helping them through both physical and emotional trauma. When she first saw Shadow, she immediately recognized the signs of deep mourning. The sunken eyes, the loss of appetite, the restless behavior. These were all things she had seen before. But then, as she observed him more closely, she noticed something that sent a chill down her spine. Shadow wasn't just weak. He wasn't just sad. He was waiting. She knelt beside him, running her fingers gently through his fur, whispering his name. Shadow barely reacted. His breathing was slow, his body still, until suddenly his ears twitched. His eyes flickered to the door. He tilted his head slightly, as if listening. A strange feeling crept over Eleanor. She ran a full medical exam, expecting to find an underlying condition. She checked his heartbeat, tested his reflexes, drew blood. Everything came back normal. No infections. No internal injuries. No medical explanation for his deterioration. But something still felt off. That night, as she watched him from the other side of the glass at the clinic, she noticed it again. Shadow wasn't just sitting still, he was listening. His body was tense, his ears shifting ever so slightly, as if he were tuned into a frequency no one else could hear. Then, in the dead silence of the room, his tail moved. Not a normal wag. It was slow, uncertain. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. It was as if he was responding to something. She stepped closer, watching intently. The seconds dragged on, heavy with something unexplainable. Then, for just a moment, she swore she heard it too. A whisper, faint, distant, like a voice carried on the wind. But the room was empty. The next morning, unable to shake the eerie feeling, Eleanor decided to check again. She placed her stethoscope against Shadow's chest, listening carefully. His heartbeat was strong, steady. But then her hands froze. There was another sound. A faint, almost imperceptible rhythm. A second heartbeat. She adjusted the stethoscope, pressing harder, her own heart hammering in her chest. It wasn't possible. She moved to another part of his body, testing again. The second beat remained. No, that couldn't be right. Her pulse quickened as she pulled away, staring at Shadow. He was looking directly at her now, his deep brown eyes filled with something indescribable. A plea. A silent, desperate plea. Eleanor swallowed hard. Every logical explanation told her it was impossible. But deep down, she felt something stir. A cold, undeniable realization creeping into her thoughts. Shadow wasn't just grieving. He was connected to something, to someone. And whatever it wasn't finished yet. Dr. Eleanor Graves sat frozen in her chair, her fingers gripping the edge of her desk as she replayed the moment over and over again in her mind. A second heartbeat. It made no sense. Shadow was a single living being, yet she had heard something impossible. A cold sweat formed at the nape of her neck. Was it a mechanical error? A malfunction of the stethoscope? Or was it something beyond science's understanding? She shook her head, forcing herself to think rationally. There had to be an explanation. With trembling hands, she ran a final scan on Shadow, using advanced medical equipment that left no room for error. The monitor displayed his vitals, strong heart rate, low oxygen levels due to his refusal to eat, minor muscle loss from his inactivity. Everything checked out. Everything except the anomaly. And then, it happened again. The machine beeped irregularly. Eleanor's breath caught as she saw the fluctuation in the readings. The rhythm wasn't coming from Shadow's heart. It was something external, something unseen, something that pulsed in a faint, unsteady pattern. It wasn't mechanical and it wasn't biological in any way she could understand. It was almost otherworldly. Her mind raced, She had read stories before. Tales of deep, unbreakable bonds between dogs and their owners. Some dogs had been known to wait years for their humans to return, standing by doors and gravesites long after logic dictated they should move on. But this was different. This wasn't just grief. It was as if Shadow could hear something, feel something, something beyond the physical realm. Her pulse pounded as she glanced at Shadow, who lay motionless on the table. Then, without warning, his ears twitched, his head jerked up, his eyes widened, fixating on something unseen. And then he barked, a sharp, desperate sound that sent a shockwave through Eleanor's spine. He leapt from the table, nearly knocking over medical equipment, his tail wagging frantically as if someone had just walked into the room. But there was no one there. The clinic was silent except for the sound of Eleanor's ragged breathing and the beeping of the machines. Shadow wasn't just reacting to thin air. He was responding to something. And then, a single thought formed in Eleanor's mind. A thought so impossible, so irrational, that she immediately tried to suppress it. What if Caleb wasn't completely gone? What if, in some way that science couldn't explain, Shadow could still sense him? Her hands trembled as she reached for her phone. She needed to call someone. Anyone. But before she could dial, Shadow did something that made her stomach drop. He whined. A deep, sorrowful sound that carried a weight of urgency. Then he turned, bolted to the door, and started scratching frantically, barking in sharp, desperate bursts. Eleanor's heart pounded. It was as if he was trying to lead her somewhere. Somewhere important. Somewhere urgent. Eleanor didn't question it. She grabbed her coat, threw open the door, and followed Shadow as he charged out into the night. The air was crisp, biting against her skin as she ran behind him, her mind racing faster than her feet. She had no idea where they were going. Shadow had never been to her house before. He didn't know the streets, the turns, the city layout. And yet, he ran with determination, like he had a destination etched into his very soul. Through alleyways, past empty sidewalks, across intersections where the traffic lights glowed red against the pavement. The few people out at this hour turned their heads as the German Shepherd sprinted past them, his body tense with urgency. Eleanor barely kept up, her lungs burning as they reached the outskirts of the city. And then, her heart nearly stopped. Shadow was heading toward the cemetery. No, it wasn't possible. It had been weeks since Caleb's funeral. Shadow had only been there once. He had no way of remembering the exact route. No way of knowing the grave's precise location. Yet here he was, charging forward like a creature possessed. Eleanor's breath hitched as she followed him past the gates, stumbling over uneven ground, her eyes adjusting to the dim light. The wind whispered through the trees, rustling the leaves as she spotted Shadow ahead of her, standing completely still, right in front of Caleb Hunter's grave. The German Shepherd's body trembled. His tail wagged slowly, hesitantly, as if he was seeing something Eleanor could not. And then, to her horror, he let out a whimper and collapsed to the ground, his breathing shallow, his body completely still. Eleanor's chest tightened. No, this couldn't be happening. She rushed to his side, her fingers pressing against his fur, feeling for his heartbeat. It was still there, faint but steady. But something had changed. Shadow's expression was different, his eyes wide, almost serene. And then, as if he had been waiting for something, his mouth parted, and he released a final, exhausted breath. Not of pain, not of suffering, but of peace. And then, just as the wind howled through the cemetery, Eleanor heard it. A voice, soft, gentle, familiar. "Good boy, Shadow. You can rest now." Eleanor's blood turned to ice. She looked around wildly, but there was no one at all. Shadow's body relaxed, his eyes closing. But before he drifted into unconsciousness, something strange happened. His lips curled slightly, just enough to form what could only be described as a smile. Tears blurred Eleanor's vision. She didn't understand what had happened. She didn't know if she ever would. But one thing was certain. Shadow had been waiting for something, and now finally he had found it. The cemetery was eerily quiet, the crisp night air wrapping around Eleanor and Shadow like a veil of stillness. The world felt suspended in time, as if waiting for something unseen to unfold. Eleanor's heartbeat thundered in her chest as she knelt beside Shadow, her mind struggling to process what had just happened. The dog, who had been motionless for what felt like hours, had suddenly shifted, his body trembling with something beyond comprehension. For days, Shadow had been spiraling into grief, refusing to eat, refusing to move, as though life itself had lost meaning. But now, in this moment, something was different. His breathing, once shallow and strained, had steadied. His ears twitched as though catching the faintest sound, something beyond human perception. His dark eyes, once filled with sorrow, now held a quiet understanding. Eleanor's fingers trembled as she brushed against his fur. "Shadow," she whispered, her voice breaking. Shadow didn't look at her. His gaze was fixed ahead, his nose twitching, his body still. Then, in a slow, deliberate motion, he stretched his head forward, as if reaching for something unseen. His tail, which had not wagged in days, gave the faintest, hesitant movement. And then he did something that made Eleanor's breath hitch. He let out a soft whine. Not one of pain, not one of distress, but something else. Something that carried relief, as if he had finally found what he had been looking for. A cold shiver ran down Eleanor's spine. She turned, her eyes scanning the darkness, searching for any logical explanation. There was no one there, just the graves, the wind, and the silence. But the feeling, the overwhelming presence of something beyond her understanding, was undeniable. Shadow's entire body softened. His tail wagged again, this time stronger. His chest lifted as he took a deep, steady breath. His eyes, brimming with something almost serene, finally turned toward Eleanor. And in them, she saw something that made her own tears fall freely. Peace. It was as if he had received the sign he had been waiting for. As if, in that brief moment, his grief had been acknowledged by the very soul he had been mourning. Eleanor swallowed the lump in her throat. "You saw him, didn't you?" she whispered. Shadow didn't need to respond. The answer was clear. She wiped at her tears, laughing softly despite herself. "I don't know how, I don't know why, but you got to say goodbye, didn't you?" Shadow gave a slow blink, then nudged his head against her hand, his warmth grounding her in a way she hadn't expected. It was a moment she would never forget, a moment that changed everything. It was then that Eleanor truly understood the depth of the bond Shadow and Caleb had shared. It wasn't just companionship. It wasn't just loyalty. It was something eternal, something unbreakable even in death. She had always believed grief meant letting go, that moving forward required releasing the past. But now she saw the truth. Grief wasn't about forgetting. It was about carrying love forward, about honoring what had been lost while still choosing to live. Shadow had found his closure. He had felt Caleb's presence, and in doing so had found the strength to keep going. And so had she. The days that followed felt lighter. Shadow, who had once refused to touch his food, now ate with renewed energy. His steps were steadier, his eyes brighter. He no longer lay by the door, waiting for Caleb to return. He no longer whimpered in the quiet of the night. He still looked toward the door sometimes, but not out of sadness, out of remembrance. Eleanor watched him closely, marveling at the transformation. It was as if Caleb's spirit had given him permission to live again. The police department had heard about what happened. Officers who had served alongside Caleb visited Shadow, sharing stories of his bravery, his kindness, his unwavering dedication. "He was the best partner I ever had," one officer murmured, scratching behind Shadow's ears. "He always said Shadow wasn't just his K9, another added. "He was his family." Shadow wagged his tail, his body relaxing into the touch of those who had loved Caleb just as much as he had. One afternoon, a young recruit named Ryan knelt beside Shadow, watching him carefully. "He really was your best friend, huh?" he murmured. Shadow's dark eyes met his, steady and knowing. Ryan smiled sadly, reaching out a hand. "I think he'd want you to keep protecting people." just like he did. There was a long pause. Then, as if he understood every word, Shadow nudged Ryan's hand, pressing his head firmly against the young officer's palm. Eleanor felt her chest tighten. It was as though, in that moment, Shadow had made a choice. The past would always be a part of him. Caleb would always be a part of him. But life was still moving forward. And Shadow, with all the love he carried, was ready to move forward with it. From that day on, Shadow became a symbol of resilience at the precinct. Officers spoke of him with admiration, knowing he carried the heart of a true warrior. He had lost his best friend, but he had not lost his purpose. He would continue to serve, to protect, to live, because that's what Caleb would have wanted. And though the world could not see it, though logic could never explain it, Shadow knew the truth. Somewhere, somehow, his best friend was still watching over him. And that was enough. If the story moved you, remember the incredible bond between humans and animals is something truly special. Dogs like Shadow aren't just pets. They're family, protectors, and loyal beyond words. Have you ever experienced a moment with an animal that felt almost beyond this world? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear your stories. And if you believe in the unbreakable connection between a loyal dog and its owner, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more heart-touching stories.